There has recently been some criticism of Chain of Command being a static game, and that after deploying enough jump off points, the game degenerates into a long range shooting match. Actually, this is not a recent thing, and it's been an accusation that's always been levelled at the game since it was first produced. However, the game is actually designed with numerous mechanics to allow players to take full advantage of fire and manoeuvre, which were the small unit tactics of the Second World War. In this video, I'm going to give you a few tips on how to get your men up and at 'em. I have gone over the command dice and their use in some detail in a previous video, so go and check that out. Even though there's a few mistakes in there, it will give you a good idea of how the command dice work and what you can do with them in a phase. And I'm not going to dwell too much on the command dice in this video. In this video we're going to take a deep dive into movement itself, and then also look at how you can move across the battlefield in Chain of Command safely. Right, so first of all let's look at basic movements in Chain of Command. When a unit, that is either a team or a section, is activated, either by their own command dice or by a junior or senior leader using their command initiatives, the unit has a choice of moving or firing. Movement is governed by dice rolls in Chain of Command, and you, as the player, declares where the unit will move to before you roll the dice. The dice roll represents a number of things. It could be that the men are cautiously moving forward. However, it could also represent the point in their movement when the enemy interrupts them. It could be just the men getting stuck behind obstacles, or any number of battlefield factors. Each pip on the dice equals an inch of movement, and this may be affected by moving through different terrain or crossing obstacles. The rules cover all this completely, so I'm not really going to go into this because I'm just doing an overview. However, the declaration could simply be however far I roll, or something more specific, such as in line with this wall. You roll your dice and you move the unit to their declared position, or at least towards it. If you are moving towards a specific point, then you may end up rolling more pips than inches that you need to get there, but the unit will stop at the point that you declared, so it is important to understand the movement available to you before declaring the move, as you may end up in an exposed position by not rolling enough pips. So these are the basics of movement, but as always it gets a little bit more complicated. When the unit moves, you've got three choices as to how fast they will move. You can use tactical movement, normal movement, or at the double. Each have their own benefits and penalties, but they will suit specific situations. So let's take a look at them now individually. Tactical movement is defined as the men cautiously proceeding whilst under cover to edge forward, and for this they roll 1d6 for the number of inches they will move, and then end the movement on a tactical stance. Being in a tactical stance means that the cover that the unit is in is increased by one level. In the open becomes light cover, and light cover becomes hard cover. However, hard cover does not increase. So if you have a large area to cross to get behind some actual cover and you feel that you may not make it, using tactical movement is useful here, as you'll be in some form of cover at least by the end of the movement, providing some protection from enemy fire. A unit can adopt a tactical stance without being ordered by a junior leader using their command initiatives, and remember that units that have just deployed can also be put on a tactical stance. However, a downside to this is that the unit is not able to fire whilst in tactical stance. And another thing to remember is that tactical stances are removed at the end of the turn, so it's best not to hang around in open fields for too long. Normal movement is further broken down into two types. You may use 2d6 to move the unit, or 1d6 to move and fire at half effect. You may fire then move, or move then fire, the choice is yours, but the fire will always be at half effect. There are some nations that have characteristics that negate this moving and firing penalty, such as the US, but in general, if you move and fire, you're going to be penalised for it. Unlike with tactical movement, where you have an equal chance of moving either 1 inch or 6 inch, or any inches in between, normal movement is less swingy in terms of results due to using a 2d6. A roll of 2d6 creates a bell curve of results, with a 7 being the average roll. In fact, it's actually a 1 in 6 chance of it happening, and this is pretty close to the usual 6 inch fixed movement for most wargames. And using the law of averages, you have about a 42% chance of moving somewhere between 6 and 8 inches using a normal movement in Chain of Command. The flip side of this is that the chance of the unit only moving 2 inches or speeding along at 12 inches is about 1 in 36, or just under a 3% chance. So understanding these levels of chance gives you a way of assessing the situation when using normal movements. Then the final movement rate is at the double. This sees the unit moving 3d6, but taking a point of shock on each team within the unit. The benefits are that the unit will probably move further, but are affected by a disorder through the addition of shock. It's worthwhile noting that this shock does not affect the unit until after they have moved. That is, it doesn't reduce the pips rolled on the dice for this movement. Using at the double is useful when you need to cross a big open space. And then going back to the maths, you may roll between 3 and 18 inches for movement using at the double, but due to the bell curve you're most likely only to roll a 10 or 11, with a 12% chance of one or the other coming up, or about a 24% chance of either being rolled. Going further, getting a number between 9 and 12 increases the odds to about 47%. So again, take this into consideration when moving and how far you want the unit to go. At the double is best used with one single team moving with a leader who is also activated and then able to reduce the shock off the unit immediately. Obviously, this opportunity is not always available, but it is worth keeping in mind. A note to remember is that when activated, the individual teams within the sections can both choose to move using separate dice rolls. This does risk breaking up the section and putting the teams more than 4 inches apart though, so it's worth considering once again if it's worthwhile for the tactical situation that you are actually in. Okay, so we looked at how the rules about movement work in Chain of Command. So let's look at how best to utilise the movement on the battlefield during a game. With the proliferation of automatic weapons in the Second World War, soldiers tried as little as possible to move around in the open, seeking cover as much as possible. If cover wasn't immediately available, they would attempt to move in what are called tactical bounds. This means moving from one piece of cover to another as quickly as possible, but by using the shortest route possible. Obviously, this may mean that it can take a while to cross a large area if you are just dashing forward in short leaps, but keep this in mind when you're playing, as it is the easiest way to avoid your men getting shot at. Running through the centre of an open field is likely to end in tears, but slowly working your way around the hedgerows on the edges keeps the men in cover and also reasonably safe. Now this may seem like common sense, but it is surprising how many wargamers don't consider this in their games, which is why I'm mentioning it here. The slow and arduous task of moving in tactical bounds is helped out in Chain of Command with a couple of additions to the toolbox. Namely, these are Overwatch and Covering Fire. Of the two, Covering Fire is the one that is overlooked the most in Chain of Command, not least of all by myself. But both of these will help players in moving across the table by giving them a support network against enemy action. So let's examine these in a little bit more detail before discussing how we can use them. Both Overwatch and Covering Fire require a junior or senior leader present to use their command initiative to activate. Also, in both cases, the unit using the action needs to be stationary. For a unit to be put on Overwatch requires the leader to spend one command initiative per team that he places on Overwatch. So a section made up of 2 teams will require 2 command initiatives. The Overwatch covers an area of 90 degrees to the front of the unit, and they may react to enemy units moving in that area and in line of sight. Units on Overwatch may also react to an enemy firing, but only after the enemy has fired, so it does have some disadvantages. Also, note that an enemy unit deploying doesn't count as moving, so a unit may only react to them in Overwatch if the unit deploys and then fires. For a unit to use Covering Fire, the leader must once again use a command initiative to instruct the men to lay down the fire. Covering Fire is used against terrain features, such as buildings, woods, hedges, etc., and has a width of 4 inches if it is a single team, or 9 inches if it is a full section doing the Covering Fire. Any enemy unit under Covering Fire will fire with a -1 to hit on their dice scores. The Covering Fire will last until the end of the next phase, whether that is the player's phase or the enemy's phase. So looking at these on a basic level, it may seem that Overwatch is a superior stance to place your men on in a game, as you may get to cause damage on the enemy. But, as always, it really depends on the situation, and both have their strengths in the right place. Overwatch is useful if you are not actually facing the enemy, but you think they may appear at any moment, such as deploying from a jumping off point, or moving across open terrain themselves. It's important to remember that each individual team is placed on Overwatch. This is an advantage when it comes to moving forward in tactical bounds. It is a simple process of placing one or other team on Overwatch. Let's say for this example, the LMG team are placed on Overwatch to cover the area most likely to house the enemy. Meanwhile, the junior leader uses the second command initiative to instruct the rifle team to move across the area into cover, using whichever movement rate is required to reach that cover. Keep in mind the leader's command radius here, and if you only have a junior leader available, it might be worth doing a short tactical bound of less than 6 inches to keep the men within his command radius. You'll need to keep them in command radius to then put the rifle team on Overwatch as the LMG dashes across either to join the rifles or moves further forward, leapfrogging the rifles, but still under the protection of their Overwatch. It is actually probably worthwhile here to only move at tactical speed, as this will ensure that the rifle team are in a tactical stance at the end of their move, which is good if they don't reach the cover they are making for, or it just makes the cover better anyway. As I've said before, you have to have a leader present to put the men on Overwatch, so if you're wanting to cross a longer distance that may split the section and put one team out of command radius, a good option is also to place the LMG team on Overwatch, then move the leader with the rifle team as far forward as you want to go, even using multiple phases to get there. The Overwatch will remain on the LMG team until the end of the turn. Then, once the rifles have moved into a position, use the leader to then place them on Overwatch and bring up the LMGs to their new position within the command radius, and just repeat the process. Slowly working your way towards a goal using tactical movement is probably a better option than running pell-mell, just in case the enemy appear and start shooting. Here we have a dug-in German MMG that is on Overwatch. This is covering the area that this British section has to cross to try to move to the rear of the MMG to close assault it. The British here could engage the MMG in a firefight, but they will soon lose. I am assuming that we have enough in our command dice rolls to allow the following examples, and also that the British section is controlled by a junior leader. We now have a choice of how to proceed with our goal, and the simplest way is to split the section into the rifles and the LMG teams and send the rifle team across the hedgerow to move around the flank and to the rear of the MMG. We can also fire with the LMG team as the rifles move, hoping to cause casualties and shock on the MMG. However, mathematically this is not great. We are rolling 6 dice, hitting on a 4+, so probably only 3 will hit. However, the Germans are in heavy cover, meaning that to cause either a shock or a kill they will need a 5 or a 6 respectively. This further reduces our chances of doing anything by 2/3. So only 3 hits may be caused, and of those on average only 1 will actually do anything, and that may only be a single shock. You could arguably be lucky and hit with all 6 dice and then kill with all 6 hits, but the likelihood of that is vanishingly low. Most likely is the German MMG will survive and be in a position to open fire with 10 dice as the rifles move in light cover along the hedgerow, causing a potential of 5 hits on the rifles. In this situation, Overwatch is the least useful of our options. Placing the LMG team on Overwatch whilst the rifle moves means that the LMG will only react if the MMG fires, and still with the same poor odds as before, so it's not looking very good for the rifles, is it? We can tip the balance in our favour, using a few more of the other aspects of movement and covering fire. First, our junior leader instructs the LMG to fire covering fire at the MMG position. This will not cause them to react with their Overwatch fire, so we can now send the rifle team forward using tactical movement. They may not get very far, but they will be in a tactical position now behind the hedge. We've now suddenly increased their cover from light to hard. The covering fire doesn't cause casualties on the MMG, but it will affect its fire by reducing the chances of hitting. If the MMG uses its Overwatch to interrupt the movement of the rifles at this range, it has gone from needing 4+ now to needing 5+. So instead of an average of 5 hits, we are looking at maybe 2 or 3 hits on average. The moving troops will only become tactical at the end of their move, so if they are interrupted before they have moved the full distance, they will still be in light cover, meaning that the kills are unlikely if the MMG is only rolling for the effect of 3 hits. Remember though, that the unit will be in a tactical stance during the next phase, if it is the German phase, and the Germans will still be under covering fire until the end of their phase, meaning the rifles are now in hard cover and the MMG will still be suffering that -1 to hit. I know by this stage people will be screaming "smoke" at the screen, and I haven't forgotten it. Particularly as a British player using their 2-inch mortar, smoke is incredibly useful in also allowing movement across open areas, and this really should be the primary role of the British 2-inch mortar team in a game. Firing with high explosive with them can be desultory with only a firepower of 2, so laying smoke is a much better option for getting your men moving. Mortar smoke will block line of fire completely and is unlimited unless the light mortar rolls double 1. So with this in mind, the British player should absolutely saturate an area in a smoke, especially if it's giving you trouble. Beyond this, most infantry also carry smoke grenades. However, the men are limited in the number of smoke grenades they have access to, depending on the command level of the leader with the unit. Smoke grenades will add a cumulative -1 effect to hit in addition to any other effects. So in our situation with the MMG undercovering fire, adding a good dose of smoke is going to make it even harder for the MMG to hit, with it now needing a 6. Remember though, that ordering a man to throw a smoke grenade will cost the leader a command initiative, so it may be that you will need a good roll of command dice to lay covering fire, throw a smoke grenade and get the rifle team to move. A senior leader will have no trouble with this, but a junior leader with his 2 command initiatives will also require a team roll of 1 on the command dice to get the rifles to move. I've only spoken about individual sections in these examples, but remember that multiple sections can also cover one another as they move about on the tabletop using the exact same sequence of tactical bound movement with covering fire and Overwatch. They're just 2 examples of the existing toolbox that's already within the moving and firing rules. So now we're going to turn to something a little bit more complex, and that is moving jumping off points and deploying reserves. When you finish the patrol phase, you will set up your jumping off points. Where these should be ideally placed is a video in itself, and I'm not going to go into it here. Suffice to say that they should be in a good position to cover one another and ensure that your deployment from them doesn't leave units isolated. One of the main things that can be easily missed in Chain of Command is the movement of a jumping off point during a game. It requires the player to build up a full chain of command dice, and the rules also require that the jumping off place may be moved in any direction up to 18 inch, as long as it is at the rear of a friendly unit and in or behind cover of any deployed enemy unit. Given that you have to build up your chain of command points, this is not an option that will be available immediately, but it is something to keep in mind as the game progresses. So, in simple terms, it requires a player to have some form of reserve, be that a section or a discrete team that has not yet deployed, and for some other units to have been pushed forward. You are allowed to move your jumping off point forward and deploy a section or a team from it immediately, providing you have the requisite command dice to do so. This can be a nasty surprise for the enemy when your troops are suddenly appearing on their flank or threatening their rear areas. The simplest way to move your jumping off points forward is by using the tactical bound movements as described before. That is, a slow, incremental shift until you have amassed a chain of command dice and are then in a good position. However, a slightly quicker way is through the use of scout teams. Both the American and Soviet lists in the rulebook have rules covering their scouts specifically, but all nations can form scout teams from their existing sections. This will cost 1 command initiative for the leader, and these men break off to act independently of the section on the command roll of a 1. Scouts have a number of uses. 1 being to harass the enemy's jumping off points, forcing them to deploy their reserves, but they can also be used to bring forward your own jumping off points. Keeping a scout team out of trouble is pretty easy, as long as you work your way across a table using the existing cover and staying out of line of sight of the enemy. Then, once they are in a good position, you can spend the chain of command dice and get that jumping off point forward. Remember that you can move jumping off points as many times as you have chain of command dice available. So, with numerous dice built up, you can actually bounce a jumping off point quite far forward. Once the jumping off point is in its new position, you then may deploy any reserve units from it without having to go through the slow process of tactical bounds. Hopefully this video has given you a few ideas about how to utilise movement in Chain of Command, and the game is not a game of static firefights, it just requires a little thinking outside the box and also using that toolbox that is inherent in the game itself. If you've enjoyed this video, please hit that subscribe button. Also, do check out my Patreon and also channel memberships for ad-free early access videos, and I will see you in the next Storm of Steel video.